Hello? Oh, hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello again. It's time for another vlog. This time I want to kind of continue from where I left off last week and where we were talking about character development and branch that into world building, because character building and world building are actually very similar concepts. When you're creating a world or creating a literal world, like a planet, or like creating civilizations or organizations of some kind, world building, stuff like that, is very similar to character building in the sense that you can actually think of a world as a character on its own. Worlds experience a sort of character development as they go on. Like the same things you think of when you're thinking of how to create a character. Like, where did this character come from? What does this character want? What has happened to this character in the past, and how does that affect where they are now and where they're going? The same sort of things happen with worlds. You can think of in terms of if you're creating a actual like science fiction or high fantasy world where you're creating the entire thing from scratch and it's not depending in any way on the real world that we live in, then you have to think of the history of this world. What happened to this world? How did it originate? What happened to it in its past? If you're thinking of a high fantasy world, maybe it was created by a godlike entity or several godlike entities or something of that nature. Maybe it is a flat world that lives on the back of a giant turtle. It doesn't matter. But either way, you're thinking in terms of how did this world come to exist? That will affect the way events transpired from the point of this world's origin to the beginning of your story. For example, if there was some kind of a huge natural disaster, like asteroid hit the planet and wiped out most of the life on it in its early days, or there was some kind of a plague, a natural disaster in those respects. Maybe there was a war between gods or between this evil Sauron type entity, and there was he almost took over the world and destroyed all freedom and stuff like that, but failed thanks to a last alliance of men and elves. That's Lord of the Rings I just told you about. But if you think about how our world would have grown and developed if something like that had happened, how would it have been if in the early days of human history we had this interloper, this evil force of literal embodied evil conquering the world, wiping out everyone, destroying everything, and spreading this plague of darkness and corruption all over the world, and only by the skin of our teeth did we finally unite and defeat this foe. How would civilization have changed following that? Where would we have gone? How would it have worked? Would it have strengthened our relationships with other nations or other peoples? Because in a fantasy and sci-fi type environment, you can have other species, which carries the sort of racial understanding we have to another level. Would it have strengthened those relationships, or would it have created tensions between them? Maybe in the aftermath of this catastrophe, we competed with each other over the whatever resources remained, or we disagreed over who should rule this new alliance we had, or someone did something out of necessity or their understanding of necessity that hurt another race, and there's been tension between them ever since. Any number of things happen. And those are all things that function as character development for these civilizations. Like, when I said you can think of a civilization or a world or a culture as a person, you think this group of people is united under some commonality, whether it simply be they all live in the same place, or they all share a belief in a common deity, or they have all been subjugated by the same oppressive force or something like that. They'll all share some common thread, which makes it so, and to a certain degree, you can think of a culture in terms of a person. You can do this in the real world to a degree, but you shouldn't, because it results in oversimplification and tends to result in some form or another of xenophobia, which, since it happens in the real world, it's perfectly legitimate to explore that in a fantasy world. In fact, that's a good idea, because then you're exploring things in a way that can challenge people to think about the way they see our own world. What fantasy can do specifically, and sci-fi can do it too, but it happens more in fantasy, you can create this enemy that is unquestionably evil. Like my Lord of the Rings reference, Sauron is evil. No one on Earth, no one in all of Middle-earth would disagree that Sauron is evil. He is the most evil entity that currently exists in this world. And everyone who works for him, all the orcs, all of the Balrogs, all of the dragons, whatever the heck he's got, they're all equally evil. They have no redeeming qualities. They are 100% bad. Which makes it easier to see them as the unifying enemy. In the real world, that is not the case. You'll have people who do very evil things, but you'll never have any human being who is evil incarnate, who has absolutely zero redeeming qualities. It just doesn't exist in the real world. People have a tendency to see things in those ways, but it is not the case. And that is a problem where we get into oversimplification and painting entire cultures with a broad brush. Like, you can have individual people who are extremely evil, who they have good traits, but they're very, very small. Like the old adage of Hitler loved dogs. Because he did. He cared about his dogs very much. So there's one single redeeming quality that Hitler had, but he was still an extremely bad person. Don't misquote me and think that I'm approving of Hitler, because I'm certainly not. But he can sort of serve as the example of the ultimate evil person. There have been many other evil people as well. That's not really in question. The question is whether or not they are literally 100% evil, because they're not. But in that case, can you necessarily, I'm treading on this subject cautiously, bear with me, can you necessarily say every single member of the Nazi Party was as evil as Hitler? I don't think you can say that, because that's millions of people. Millions of people. There were people who were a part of the Nazi Party because it was what was happening in their world, and they didn't really see it as a big deal because they were a part of it. It didn't affect them negatively. They were citizens in this world, and it just came with the territory of where they were. There were some people who were reluctant members of that society, who saw the problems with it. There were people who even used it in terms of like people who were harboring Jewish fugitives, who were trying to help fix the system or to mitigate the damage done by the system from within. Technically, they could be considered members of the Nazi Party on some level because they were citizens under the Nazi name, but you wouldn't really consider them to be Nazis necessarily. I'm going off on a little tangent here, but my main point was saying you can't really... Oh, man. People are going to think I approve of Nazis. I don't, but I'm saying that you can't paint with a huge broad brush and treat every single member of this civilization as being the same. Not every Nazi was Hitler. I'm using Nazis as an example specifically because they're evil as heck, and that is a legitimate take on the thing. Like, you can consider Nazis to be the enemy of that period in human history, because they were a bad group. Definitely a bad group, no question there. But there's room to tell stories within there of people who did not meet with that common trait of the evilness that embodied the Nazi Party. One of the go-to examples of evil in our world is the Nazi Party. Like, people make Nazi comparisons anytime they want to call somebody a bad person. If they want to call your argument invalid, if they want to say that your standpoint is evil and bad, they'll compare you to Nazis. It's an old thing, and it's like the default way to lose an argument is to compare somebody to a Nazi because it's just too easy, because it makes everyone mad, because no one wants to be compared to a Nazi, because Nazis were evil. And nobody is probably as evil as the Nazi Party in general. But you also have to consider the fact that Nazis were a group of people, a massive group of people, a group of people that encompassed millions, and not all of them are going to be as evil as Hitler. They're just not, because Hitler was on a level of his own. He was the main reason why the Nazi Party was so bad, but he was playing upon the evil in humanity by appealing to common issues of racism and xenophobia and generally the worst that humanity has to offer. He appealed to that in people and brought it out. So he's in a lot of ways responsible for stimulating the evil that already existed in the people there. But you're not going to find every single member of this culture, the Nazi culture, you're not going to find them all to be as evil as Hitler, because some of them will just be just following orders, or they'll be maybe even people who are objectors to the Nazi ideal, but they're stuck in the system anyway. They couldn't all just leave, so there's all kinds of people who would fit under that umbrella. So you want to be careful about overgeneralizing any specific civilization or race or group. You want to show the rule. In the Nazi instance, it would be the rule of Nazis being evil, generally being evil, being racist, being oppressive, and having no tolerance for those that are not themselves. Show the rule, but also show the exceptions. Show maybe the one Nazi officer who's not on board with the Nazi regime. Maybe the one person who's trying to change it from within. Maybe the one person who's trying to even take the evil that's already there and make it manifest as another kind of evil. Maybe he wants to steer away from the xenophobia aspect and turn it into something more centered around religious persecution or personal gain. Maybe there's someone who wants to be the new Hitler and they want to take over, and there's factions that arise. You could do stuff like that. So, as much as you can consider a particular civilization or group of people to be a person, you should also still keep in mind that it is a person that consists of other persons, and they're not all going to be the same. It is so lazy when you show a fantasy race or a sci-fi race of creatures that are all functionally the same person. That doesn't work. Like, it really doesn't work. Unless you're doing something where it's maybe they're angels or something and they don't have an actual free will. They're bound to follow the instructions of a deity that controls them, and they don't individually have freedom of decision. You could do something like that, I suppose, and that wouldn't be a bad idea, but everyone should still have a unique personality. There should be aspects of them that conform with this ideal and some that don't, because that's how people are in real life. And like I said last week, you want to make so your people feel real. And you have to think in terms of balancing the overall way this world works. If you want to do something like the Lord of the Rings thing where there's just this one organization that serves as the ultimate evil and everyone else is against them, they shouldn't be the embodiment of all the evil in the world. There's still going to be just people, like normal mundane people who are bad people. Like, you eventually in a Lord of the Rings type of world, you might have a Sauron who's the literal embodiment of evil, but you'll probably still also at some point in history have a Hitler who's just a guy but is also a really bad guy. And in a lot of ways, those kinds of villains are more powerful in terms of their effectiveness in a literary sense than an actual force of evil. If you have a world, I keep coming back to Lord of the Rings, but it's a really good example. You have Saruman, who's also evil, but he's not an incarnation of evil. He's not the actual embodiment of evil that Sauron is. Sauron is objectively probably a more evil person than Saruman is, but Saruman's a guy. I know he's a wizard and it's different in Lord of the Rings, but that's not relevant. He still has freedom of decision. He has control over his own fate. He could choose to do what he wants to do, and he chooses actively to side with evil and to join up and enforce this evil entity's goal. And in some ways that's worse, because this is someone who could choose to be good, who could choose to use the power and resources he has to help prevent the evil from coming, but he's someone who chooses to instead further his own interests and side with the devil. Similarly, if you have a fantasy world where you have elves, dwarves, humans, all coordinating with each other, you should have a mixture of good, evil, and pretty much neutral people in there. Most people are just going to kind of be neutral. They might be pretty good, but they might be selfish. They might have a general lack of interest in heroics and rising up against the bad in the world. You'll have good, you'll have bad, and you'll have neutral, no matter what you are. And different times in a world's lifetime, different times in the world's story arc, the character arc of this planet, you'll have different states between different states of balance. It'll be, you'll have an age of good in the world where everyone's pretty much getting along, never 100% getting along, because that's, again, not how worlds work. There will always be minor conflicts, but there'll be minor conflicts. It'll be mostly a time of prosperity. It'll be like the Renaissance, where everything's going pretty well for civilization. There's advances that are made, bonds that are strengthened between nations, and things are going pretty well for humankind. But then you'll also have times where it's like the Black Plague, where there's just sickness and famine and pestilence that's not any specific person's responsibility. It's just happening in the world. You'll have times where there is just an enormous amount of war, where for whatever reason, competition for resources, competition for land, these civilizations will just not mesh at all, and they'll all be at each other's throats, and there'll just be blood and carnage everywhere. And usually after that, there'll be some kind of a denouement period where they're all warred out. They don't have any more fight in them, so they're going to have to get along. And then maybe that'll lead to better relations further down the road. Maybe it'll lead to another war shortly after, like what happened between World War I and World War II. But you have to think of the timeline of events as being fluid and having peaks and valleys. It's going to happen where things are always fluid. It's never going to be a straight line of equilibrium. And you should always think of a world as a thing that evolves over time. As technologies rise and fall, as civilizations rise and fall, as belief systems and ideals rise and fall, as resources become plentiful or less plentiful, it's going to change the way the entire system works, the way every individual nation works, every culture, every civilization, every corporation, whatever it may be. And that in turn is going to affect the world that the characters in your story live in, what they know of the world, what the world is to them, what their idea of their place in it may be, and what they want out of their world. You have to understand what kind of a world your characters live in in order to understand how they relate to each other and to the events that are happening around them. So, in summary, treat a world like a person. Treat the people in that world as being persons as well. And make sure that none of them stay completely static. They should always grow and always change.